All right, so welcome everyone. Again, today we are covering the graphing functionality within ARM. We'll see the different graphs we can generate, various options to kind of control what it is we see on the graph, and we'll also kind of show maybe a multi-column graph as well as part of that. So here in ARM, I have just an example trial here, not a whole lot of excitement, but I've got a couple of assessments that have been filled in. In my case, they look like they're stand counts, as well as a PHI-gen in the middle of it. So we'll just dive in here to the graphing functionality for kind of visualizing the data that we have here in this trial. So at the top of ARM, there is a graph menu, and I'm going to generate a new one. A couple of questions to kind of set the stage, create this graph for us. The first one is the treatments. If we want to include all of the treatments, we can leave this blank and just press OK, or you can select certain ones. Maybe I want to leave out my untreated check for whatever reason. You can certainly do that, whether you click on the treatments here or you can type in this box. The other nice thing with this selection is you can change the order. So in my case, that I think I'll just put them in reverse order just to demonstrate that this can also set the order of those treatments if you wanted to have that as part of your graph. Then when we move on, the next question is which assessment, what data do we want to graph? And I will start with column number 1. Same thing as before, though. We certainly can choose more than, we could choose more than one, or you can, click here on the headings to select the columns that we want to graph. Next is a question about labels. We can choose a particular fields from our assessment header or the description of the rating that we took. Right now, I haven't seen the graph. I usually just click OK and select whatever default. We'll be able to change that again later. And it'll make more sense because we'll actually be able to see what part of the graph we're changing, but this is just labeling the graph. All right, so then we come to the graph options here. Just to start with the most basic types that we have, we can create a bar graph, a line graph, or a box whisker. I'm going to start with just a basic bar graph, and we'll come back here in a moment to see all of the different options and things we can change. But just starting with the bar graph, when I click OK here, then we will be presented with our graph. So here we have graphed out data column 1. You can see our different treatments in the order that we selected them. And then the data being graphed out here. In this case, it's a bar graph. The little red dots that we see on here are the individual data points. I also have an error bar, and I have the label for what the actual mean was. And we'll see how we can turn some of those off and change them in a little bit. But that's the real basics here of kind of getting to the graph. And the typical workflow then to kind of change and tweak this graph to the way we like is I can leave this window open, and then down at the bottom, there is the button for the options. And that brings us back to the graph options, but it's nice because it's kind of a modal window here, so we can still see the graph behind it. So for example, maybe I want a horizontal bar graph instead. If I make a change here in the graph options, there's a button down here to apply those changes. And what's nice is now immediately behind here, we can see that change. So it can be a real nice way to tweak and play with the options to get things just right real quickly and finding out whether that option that you clicked on did what you wanted or not. I might go back to vertical, although this does look kind of nice because of our really long text here that we had for our different treatments. So stepping through some of the other options here, we mentioned those little red dots. That is tied to this display data. So here I'm showing plot means. If I did have a subsample assessment, you could actually have the individual subsample values displayed there, or if you don't want those dots at all, then you can turn them off. I'll just hit apply now, and you can see those cleared off. This very same option is in the very corner of the main graph window. So we just have a couple of options that are maybe the most common things you might want to toggle. And if you notice that those both updated at the same time, it's really the same option, just in a couple of spots to make it easy to find. So here on the bar graph, we have that orientation grouping style. So if we had multiple data sets, multiple assessments, we could stack our bars. And we'll come back to the grouping, and we'll maybe see that later when we do the multi-column selection there. If I change the graph type, you'll notice some of these options change. So just depending on what graph you're dealing with, there might be slightly different options. So here, if I now use a line graph instead, now we have different selection of, how do we want to change the, the thickness or the pattern of that line, things like that. And then the box whisker graph as well. Now we can decide how our percentiles are calculated, outliers, things like that. Whether that mean is drawn, that's the dashed line, versus the median is always there, but the mean is on. We might cycle back to the box whisker in the end here if we have time. We kind of covered it a bit a couple of sessions ago in our data review, so I won't belabor that point too much. We'll just go back to a bar graph. All of the other options that we're going to look at next really all apply regardless of your graph type. So really, it's just this screen here that kind of changes depending on what type of graph that you're generating. All right, so moving on to the next section of the graph options, fonts. So really, we have kind of full control over all the different text that you see on the screen. We can choose, basically we choose what is it I'm looking at, whether it's the title at the top. Then I can change the font. So the little button here will bring up the font dialog. I could change to a different type of font. I can change the size, underline, anything you would want stylistic wise. And then just hit apply, and you can see that'll change how that text is displayed on the graph for that particular section. So I could change the labels now. It's kind of every text that you would see on that main graph, or the title. Other titles would be like this one down here. I think it affects the label as well. Let's increase the size and just see. Yep, so it does affect the titles and the labels here on the right or the left and the bottom. So choose whatever component you want to change, and then you can alter the font. We'll kind of see that same pattern in a few other sections of just narrowing down what you want to change and then making the appropriate change. Moving on to the labels option. For this graph here, it is the labels for our treatments. So you can see the order that we selected treatments is reflected here, and we have the information copied from the treatment editor. And actually, this text here isn't live from the treatment editor. Like if I were to change something here, it's not going to affect my treatments themselves. Instead, this text is saved as part of the treatment description. And typically that you would first kind of discover that treatment description on the trial map. So let me cancel. I'm going to close this graph here just to show where that text comes from. So on the trial map, and this is built when you first create a trial, part of the trial map is the treatment description at the bottom here. So when the trial is first generated, we copy information from the treatments editor into this treatment description. So a common question sometimes is if something changed about the trial after it was first kind of planned, and there was, we needed to add a treatment or a different adjuvant was used or whatever it might be, we made a change after that trial was created, then all of a sudden I'm here in my graph and I've got that wrong information again. And that reason is that this information was copied when the trial was created, so it might need to be updated. So just like on that graph, you can hand change any of this. You can click into it and update or remove something, or there's a reset button, and that allows you to choose which columns from the treatments editor should be filled in, should be used to fill in this description. And there should be checkboxes here. I'm not sure if they show up for you for whatever reason on my screen. I'm not seeing any checkboxes, but you should have a little box in the middle there that you would click on or off to decide which columns fill in. Not sure if it's just because I'm presenting or maybe it shows up just fine for everyone else, but here on my screen, I just don't see those boxes. But at any rate, that will fill in that description for us. And that's the exact same description that we see then in the graph. So if I cancel here and I will just open up, oops. I'm at view here. We'll view the graph as we had last used it. And then back to our options and labels. So that's where this information is coming from. And again, we can change it. There's a reselect right here that's going to do the exact same thing for us. If we want to rebuild, or maybe for the graph, we want to make it even more shorthand. Maybe, maybe I'll just change it to kilograms per hectare, just to make it more shorthand, or maybe I don't really want the NIS. Whatever you might have for a reason to kind of trim that text down is certainly possible. Now that I've changed that information and I clicked apply to try to make it, kind of save that to the graph, there's a special question because, like we said, that's kind of tied in to that trial map. So ARM is asking us, now that you've changed those labels, do you want to make that same adjustment onto that trial map, that treatment description? So that's what it's asking here. Do you want to use kind of that same shorthand there as well, or not? So in my case, I'm going to say no. This is just kind of my shorthand to make this graph fit a little nicer. And actually it did exactly what I wanted, to be able to see that graph much nicer by kind of shortening those labels. So that's our treatment labels here, or the x-axis labels to be exact. A few options related to that. The data labels, that would be the label of the mean here. So if I turn that off, you'll see those means kind of disappear. I'll keep them on for now. This next one, the x-axis labels as legend, that's very nice, especially for the case we had a moment ago where your treatment description is very long. You notice it really squeezed things quite a bit. If we make those x-axis labels a legend instead, I'll move this out of the way for us, then you can see we just put in the treatment number at the bottom, and then we use a legend to have that longer description. So that's a recommended option. That's actually on the main graph window here as well, just because it's very handy if your treatments are long, or you have a lot of information there. It makes it a lot easier to fit on the graph nicer, I think. the top of this graph, you can see I've got letters. Those are the mean comparison letters right from the AOV report. So I can turn those off if I wanted, but we have those on. It is possible to have them, if I turn this option off, they can show up right near your treatment mean. I think it typically makes it a little messy. I have these error bars turned on that we can show how to turn them off in a minute, but you end up with a lot of information kind of floating around here. So I think it's kind of nice to be able to have those kind of above the x-axis entirely, way up there. But you have that option to know where those show up if you want to change that. And those are using the exact letters that you would get if you generated an AOV report right now using all of your report options. So there's a button right here to bring up those report options to make sure you have, you know, the selections that you would want to make. So that's kind of a shortcut there because it is using your report options as defined at the moment in your ARM. So that's the labels section here of our options. Moving on to legend. Actually, let me, just to make this a little more clear, let me turn off the x-axis labels as a legend. And the legend, since right now we have just one assessment, now we're not trying to combine multiple assessments, we really don't have a legend because there's only one. But this would allow us to, and when we reselect, this was that selection of the assessment header fields. So which rows from the description that we have for our assessment really encapsulates how we want to label that assessment. And so we have all those different rows. You can choose what should we call this. In our case, not particularly important for this graph since we have just the one assessment. We can return here again when we do the multi-assessment graph, and this will matter a little more for us. But very much the same thing as the labels, basically with that option to reselect and kind of regenerate the data set. One thing we do have here on this portion would be the color selection for our treatments. So if I click into a row here, this is kind of matching up with our second treatment here. So if this blue I wanted to change to a different color, maybe I'll make it this blue instead. You would just click into that row and then change the color. You could even have a pattern. Maybe I'll put a gradient on it or something like that. And when I hit apply, then you can see you can do a variety of different things with the color, the pattern for that particular treatment. So just depending on what kind of color set you might want, you can tweak each of those colors as well. And I have my untreated check, and it has a special denotation here if you have this on. Certainly possible to turn that off if you just want it to be colored like all of the rest of them. And there now it's got that purplish color, which we could always change as well if we want. So that's how we can kind of control what color, in this case, would be the bars on our graph. Same thing for the box whisker, the colors of the boxes there too. Moving on to the titles. So the graph title, to start with, at least copies from your header of the whole trial. So you have that title on the header section of a trial. It just gets copied here. Of course, we can change, whatever we might want to have. You want to change the way that the graph is titled. You certainly have the ability to change that. The bottom title here, we also have something you can place there if you want. If you don't want any title, just clearing out that text will make that whole thing disappear. So that's an easy way to turn things on or off. There's also a left and a right title. So here I have this left title, and it looks like it's taken my rating type, probably the part rated and the rating type, it looks like, from my assessment. So again, like before, we have a button here to allow us to change what fields do we want to use to build that description if we'd like. Or we could hand change this, but it's kind of nice to include the fields so that way if we change, we can go to the next column. That'll update automatically with the description from the next assessment if it is a different type of assessment. So kind of nice to utilize that. You can control how the text displays. So if you want to make it horizontal or up or down, you can change that behavior. Right now, my right title is hidden. If I type something in, you can see that we can create the right title over here as well. And again, exact same options. So whether you clear out the text, we'll make that disappear, or there's also that just the hide. So if you don't want to see the left title, you can just take it off. Okay, moving on to axis. This is kind of controlling some of the selections based on your Y and your X axis. Labels, of course, are very important. In theory, you could turn them off. Seems like a very terrible idea. You're not going to be able to explain the graph very well, but the option is there. Tick marks might be a little nicer to control, or the grid marks. So the grid marks would be kind of behind here. So if I turn on the Y grid marks, for example, that kind of changes just the way the graph appears. Might be a little easier to interpolate in this case, to see exactly where those values lie, having those horizontal grids. In this case, I think the x-axis grids would look pretty terrible, so I'll keep those off. But the option is on there. Maybe if we had the horizontal bars, that would have came in handy. Probably the most interesting option on this section is the y-axis scale. So that controls the range here for our graph. Zero origin is really nice because then it will automatically change this based on the data. So let me click OK here and just show that right here for column 1, of course, our range is between 16 and 44. I have a button at the bottom here to move to the next assessment column. So this moves us to data column 2, which in my case is all zeros. So there's not a whole lot to graph. But if I move to this third one, you'll notice then it automatically is changing that range. Now we're back to 0 to 40. So you can see the change there. Down to 0, this is basically 0 to 0, so it really isn't too exciting. Maybe I'll just sneak in some values here so we can actually see something, since that's incredibly boring. And go back to view. There we go. So now you can see that it has set things nicer for us. Let's turn on those x-axis as a legend again, so we at least can see something. So we have that changing axis from 0 to 40, going back to column 2. Now we're down to those small values that we had. And then once again, back to a kind of a normal range. So that is the axis options to have zero origin. But if you do kind of want to manually override that selection, you can do a user defined. And here now you can choose specifically, I want my minimum to be 0 and maybe the maximum should be 100. If maybe that would better represent a percent. If this was percent data, maybe that's the way I would want. It's asking about my treatment description. I'll say no. You can control how many tick marks there are. So I've only got 2 here. Probably make a lot more sense to have a few more. So maybe I want to make it 5 of them. Looks nice. So you can have that full control over the axis as well, just by using that user defined. The only downside, if you do that, here I've defined 0 to 100. Now when I press the next column, I also have 0 to 100. So there's no kind of automatic changing to something that makes sense, which might be fine. But in this case, it's a totally different type of assessment. So I would need to go to my options and adjust, either change the user defined to, down to 0 to 10 maybe, would graph those nicer. Or again, using that 0 origin is a nice way to change things. Go back to 0 origin, I think, just for simplicity, so we don't get lost later on. I think this is changing to be negative just because I've got my error bars on. So I think that's why it looks the way it does. Maybe I'll skip over to the error bar now, just to show that those have been on this whole time. You have an option to include them or turn them off. So there's a few different options you have for an error bar. So far, I've been showing the standard deviation. There is also an option to have the standard error. And those are calculated for this data set. So then as I move on to a different column, it will adjust those values based on each data set. There's also a percent value or a fixed value, or in my case, we can turn them off. So that would be the error bar. You can also do a user defined if you have your own values to put in there. Kind of unusual, but maybe it's a requirement. I'll just keep them off for now. All right, last but not least is the colors section. We've done just a little bit of colors with the treatment selection with the bar, but we really actually can control pretty much any other component of the graph. We could change the colors. So I've got the graph window, I've got the axis, the graph itself. Maybe let's look at the graph title, for example. So the graph title at the top, probably the most common question, can I get rid of this blue background? Maybe I don't want that blue box at all. One way to kind of turn that off would be to change the color of that graph title. And there's really two components to this title. There's the foreground color, which would be the text color, which is black. And then there's the background color, which right now is set to that blue by default. So we could just simply set that to white, and that'll take away all that blue. There's also a drop shadow, so there's a background to that box. And right now it's set to drop shadow to make it kind of stand out a little bit. There's also a border that just gives a square border around that area. Or you could turn that off entirely. For our example, maybe we don't want to have any background at all to that title. That's kind of the easiest way to do that, is basically just make everything white and turn off the background style as well. So for kind of each of these components, we could do the same thing with the bottom title. If we want to make it match, we can maybe set that background and turn this off to make it match. You can kind of just go through each component and make it how you would like. And the legend would apply here to that box. Maybe we want this to stand out. So maybe we actually go back and put on that color, or whatever other color might look nice to make it stand out, or whatever you'd like. You can customize those components. You could even do, just to demonstrate that foreground color, I could make that text white. If we chose that, maybe a darker background color would make it stand out, or however you want to design it. You kind of have each component is adjustable. I must have been playing around with these options because I did notice that my my numbers here are in red. So that would be the data labels. So for some reason I have them set to red. Maybe I'll put them back as black, a little more usual selection there. So you can see pretty much any component on the graph is adjustable. In that case, there was only the foreground color because it's just text that we're talking about. The graph, I think, is the entirety of the window. So that graph would be kind of behind this graph would be the color. I think the graph window would be the rest. Let me turn this back to white so we can see graph window has a background color. So that's everything else. Oops. And I always do this. It's always just a matter of time when I manage to do this during the session. But if I want to go back to my options, I'm clicking on the button and nothing's happening. Just the way these windows work, if you had happened to notice a moment ago, I had my graph options visible, and then I clicked on my graph. So this options button is seemingly doing nothing, but that's because if I slide my window over, I actually have my graph options open. It's just behind the graph window. So if for some reason the options seem broke, it's not working, it's probably because the graph options is actually somewhere on your screen and you just clicked into the graph, which then made that options window disappear behind it. So that's kind of just a tricky way, just the way that window pops up and then can end up being hidden behind there. So you can either move your graph around to try to find it, or if you hover over ARM icon down at the bottom taskbar, that graph options window kind of counts as its own window. So you can find that down at the bottom, and that'll bring up that graph options window again. So you can make your changes or close the options. So then you're looking just at the graph window, and then that options button will work because it will make this options display again. All right, I think I'm sick of that green, so let me turn that off again. Okay, so that's really a run of all of the kind of individual options to show kind of what you have control over and how you can tweak the graph to show kind of what you want. Now let's show graphing multiple columns. So we've kind of hinted at it a couple of times. So just to walk through that flow, I'm going to go back to graph and let's create a new graph. This time I'm going to take all of my treatments in the regular order we've entered them. So I'm just going to leave the box empty here. Now I want column 1 and column 3. They're both the same type of assessment. We just performed it a week later. So now when I have more than one column selected, there will be a confirmation here to make sure of what we're trying to do. We can create one graph with 2 assessment columns, which is exactly what I want to demonstrate. So we'll click yes in a moment. The other option, if we say no, would be to graph the first column we selected. And then when we press the next column button, it will go to column 3. So it'd be a way to, okay, I'm going to need to graph these 4 columns individually, but I want to skip over all those other assessments that we did that don't need any graphs. That's a way to kind of queue up which columns you care about. And then next column, previous column will iterate just through that selection we made instead of every single assessment. So I'm going to say yes in our case because I want one graph that has the 2 assessments. Same question about the header fields. I'm just going to click OK for now. And we'll do a bar graph. So now we have a bar graph for the 2 different assessments. Let me turn off the x-axis labels as a legend, so that way we can see that we do still have a legend in this case. So we want to label the 2 different assessments. So we can see we really don't know which one's which because of what we selected as our headers. So let me go into the options. And there in our legends, we've labeled these 2 data sets as the same because it was the same type of assessment. So it might make more sense for us. Let me see if this is going to work for me or not. I'm going to hide all and choose maybe the rating date would make the most sense. Not sure if that's going to turn on for me or what's going on. Nope, it did not. For whatever reason, I don't have my boxes here. I'll have to investigate that, but in theory, I would turn on the rating date instead of the rating type. I think it's part rated and rating type, probably plant and count of plants. So that would have changed. Oh, there, now it changed to pest type for me for whatever reason. It's not going to do it for us. So maybe I can hand type just for our sake. We'll just say that this isn't the actual rating date, but let's just pretend that we took the first one a week ago and then we just took this today. Obviously, we could be a little more efficient than that, but now we can have the rating date be our legend text, which in our case now kind of explains what we're looking at, so we can see how each treatment did over that course of the time. So a couple of the other options that we kind of glossed over initially, because it only applied to kind of this set. Back here on the general section, for that bar graph, we had a grouping style. So if we want, we could stack these instead or make them into a percent as well. So depending on your type of data, that might be helpful. In our case with the stand count, it wouldn't really make any sense at all. So we'll go back to the regular type. Then there's also this grouping option. So right now we have each treatment as our x-axis, but we can kind of flip that around to be by assessment column instead. So now what we have is the assessment column, the assessment date essentially, as the x-axis, and now we have a different bar for each of the treatments. So again, just depending on the type of data you want to visualize, you can kind of pivot and adjust kind of what you want to look at. Other than that, I think all of the options we looked at really are the same. They have the same impact, whether we're graphing one or multiple assessments. You can see here, we still even have like the mean separation letters are all there for each of those treatments. And things like that. We'll just have maybe more of them since we have multiple assessments, but everything else pretty much stays the same. All right. So then I guess the final example, and I said we probably won't spend a lot of time on it because we have covered it fairly well in the data review webinar we ran a few weeks back. But the other option is a box whisker. We looked at it real briefly, but I want to point out that there is a shortcut to create a box whisker on your properties panel in the assessment editor. So a lot of times when I just want to create a graph really quickly, I tend to come over here and hit the box whisker button. And whichever column that I'm clicked into will be the column that we generate a box whisker for. And you can see it just pops up immediately. There's no asking which treatments or data columns. It just pops up right away. So I kind of like that as a quick shortcut. And of course, we can always go into the options and change some of our options and things like that, even to switch it over to a bar graph or something. But that's kind of the fastest way to get a graph up on the screen to start working with. So the box whisker graph, there's a whole calculation that's involved in telling us how this is all constructed. Gives you a nice visualization of the data and kind of a sense of the variation in each treatment, things like that. But I'll kind of leave that be for now, since it's really kind of outside our just straight how to graph an ARM session there. But within the options, the kind of the last spot here that might be noteworthy, and we mentioned once, were these general options here to kind of adjust how the box percentiles, which, just the height of the box and how that's all calculated. Whether if you have subsample values, then you can decide should those percentiles be based on the individual subsamples, or should we first calculate a plot average of those subsamples, and then we just do the typical calculations. So that's kind of what we're choosing here, both for the box percentiles and then the outliers as well. If we had an outlier in our data, there'd be like an X up above here or down here to show that there's an outlier, at least as calculated by the box whisker. So that wraps up the box whisker, and I think covers all the example graphs that we can generate. So then kind of the next phase, once you have the graph the way you want, we should talk about saving the graph. So there's a couple of options here. The quickest, simplest option to say, all right, this is the visualization I like. Now I want to use it somewhere, whether it's in a PowerPoint presentation, a Word document report, whatever. There's a button at the bottom that says clipboard, or up at the top corner, there's also the very same shortcut to a clipboard button here. So either this copy or clipboard, and that basically takes a screenshot of the graph kind of in its current state, how you've sized it on your screen, and it can be really easy to then, let's just drop it into a Word document, for example. All you have to do is paste, and it's a picture here now in our Word document. You'll notice that there is no more editing. Once you press that copy, then it's just a flat picture. There's no individual components. I'm clicking here throughout, and there is no individual components you can adjust. So you would, of course, need to go back to ARM and make any change if you wanted. This is just a picture now, but it's kind of the nicest, quickest way to move it. And it does change based on how your screen is sized. So if I kind of narrow this out and then do clipboard, you can see that the picture itself will be different. So the kind of the aspect ratio that you have does really impact how that picture essentially is generated. So that's clipboard. That creates an image onto your clipboard to paste somewhere else. There's also a save. Now this save creates a GRF8 file. So that's a file that just ARM will recognize. So that's basically saving this graph file, and it includes kind of a link to this current trial. So kind of the use case would be, this is great, let me save this. It's kind of specific to this trial. Now, if there's more data that we add or make adjustments, whatever, next time we open this trial, I could open that GRF8 file, and it would remember kind of everything that we had set here specific to this trial to kind of recreate that graph. So that's what the save does. Kind of comparing that to, if I actually go to the options here, so the save is kind of saving that graph image kind of tied to the trial itself. On the graph options, we have an option to save a set. So it's kind of confusing. We've got all of these saves everywhere, but the difference here, saving the set is saving all of the options that we chose. So a lot like when we're in a report and we save a report set, we're not saving any of the data involved in the analysis. We're only saving the options we chose for ARM to create the report. So that's kind of what we're doing here with the saving the set. And it's got a different file extension. We really don't care what the extension is because that's ARM's trouble to remember. But this would be a way to save, maybe it's my, I really liked how this graph shows up, and I want to make the same type of graph every time I'm doing my final trial presentation for my company meeting at the end of the year, or whatever it is that you're doing. Just give it a name to remind yourself that of what it was that you were creating this graph for, because we're really just saving the options. So hopefully that kind of helps. Just where is it that I'm pressing the save button will kind of hopefully give a hint as to what I'm saving. Here I'm saving these graph options. And then of course, if you wanted to then later on recover those options and kind of put everything back to the way you had saved it, then there's the load set. That's kind of the same as the save set, the equivalent to it, bringing back all of your options the way you had selected them at the time that you pressed save. Just related to that, since we're right here, there's also a reset button, and that's going to reset all of these options back to the default. So if you made a mess, you don't remember where you started, you just want to take the default of how ARM typically shows a graph to start with, you can press this reset. There's a little warning to make sure you just don't accidentally press that again. Actually, let me cancel. This might be a good demonstration of the saving of a set. So I'm just going to call this webinar here. And save all of our options. So we like the way this graph was created. Now, if I do something extreme, like resetting these options all back to the defaults, now my graph looks way, way different. I go, oh no, what happened? I want it to look the way I did before. Then we can just load my set. And we'll take that one I just had created. And when I hit apply, it'll put everything right back the way it was for those options. So saving a set saves our options. Saving is kind of saving this graph specific to the trial. Finally, we got one more, save as. That's more related to the clipboard. So these two are next to each other. I would say they're kind of close together because we're really saving a picture of this graph, but instead of just putting it on our clipboard so we could paste it somewhere in another program, I can actually save this to like a JPEG or a PNG, depending on whatever image file that you would want. And then here I can just specify where I should save that image to. So if you want to create an entire image file for this graph, that's save as, we'll do that. So those are the different output options. I think the last button we haven't really clicked on would be advanced. Typically, I don't think you'd come here too often, but if you really wanted some control over some of the finer details, here it's the grid settings of where and how big the grid is. The legend, which we don't even have right now, so it's all grayed out, but you can move the legend around. The titles, we had some control on the main options, but really maybe the sizing of it. That's one option. Actually, let me close. That is one thing I kind of like to show because I think sometimes, let me reset this back to the default because you'll notice kind of the default graph options, you have like this really long box. I think sometimes it kind of looks a little ugly, maybe isn't what you want, but you don't mind the box itself. In the advanced options, the titles are all set to auto size, but maybe this left title, let's say we actually kind of would like to make it smaller. So I could auto size and adjust. So maybe the height, I don't want it quite so tall. So then I can make it smaller and then I can move it around a little bit. Little manual, it's not super easy, just click and drag, but it does let you get to put things where you'd want it to be. So that's one option for condensing that a little bit if you don't like that to spread all the way across the page. The advanced options will get you there. Down there in the corner. All right, I think we covered everything here that we have in ARM for graphing. I would point out if there's any questions, feel free to fire them off. We've got a couple of minutes. One kind of, it's not specifically what can you do in ARM for a graph, but just to point out that if you're imagining that you'd like a little more, or maybe this tool isn't quite what you need, and you have more more needs for graphing, or you're just better working with Excel or something like that. ARM does have the option, of course, to export the data. So if you want to use Excel or another tool to graph the data, certainly it's not going to hurt ARM's feelings. You can, under the file menu, there's an export study. So you can actually do a data export if you needed to get the data into a format that another program could read, and you can create graphs and charts and things like that. That would give you every single data point. If you just need like treatment means or something simple like that, you can always use the print reports. So I think the assessment data summary would be a good option. That actually does give you each assessment value, and then also gives you your plot mean. Not much else for statistics, but if you just need kind of that raw information, this is a good report that you could generate in Excel. So let me just go real quick, choose all of the data columns, and just generate that out to Excel, for example. And that report will then appear in Excel. So then you would be able to use, take that data, or maybe even just the means or whatever you need to grab to create your graph. Would be another option. And that's really the graphing tool that you have full control over. The only other spots in ARM that we have some sort of visualizations would actually fall into the print reports. Most of these are pretty much a text-based report, but we do have a dose response analysis. So you do get a graph in there to kind of show your I forget what the term would be, but you can see the kind of how your different doses responded, and then you can calculate the particular value that you're trying to figure out. But so that has that graph involved within that dose response. This trial is not set up for that, so I won't even try to display that. Maybe in help. If I have the help window anywhere. Here it is. I think I've got a picture of that graph. No, I don't. Never mind. Maybe here in the analysis graph. Anyway, if you're looking for that, that is a possibility in ARM for the dose response. Then there's also a repeated measures would be another situation that we create a graph kind of just as part of the analysis report. There's some technical spots, but then there's also a nice visualization. In the repeated measures case, you have that same assessment repeated again and again. So now you get to see the time, how time plays a role for each of those columns. Kind of like what we did with our multi-column bar graph, but in that case, it's a line graph and shows you all of the responses across time. So just a couple of other possibilities in case you're looking for something like that that are in the reports. Well, with that, we've reached our hour. Thank you all for joining. If there are any questions, I can hang on or send us into the support. But thanks for your time today, and hopefully we'll be seeing you again soon at another webinar.